Welcome to Forest for Fish. My name is Mike Smulligan. I'm a forester with the Department of Natural Resources, and in this first session, we'll take a look at some of the problems with water quality here in Michigan. Michigan is a spectacular place. It's blessed with an abundance of both forest and water resources. We have more than 20 million acres of forest, which is more than half of the land area of the state of Michigan. The commercial forest products industry is a major contributor to our economy in the state, with more than $21 billion in our forest products industry. Our 20 million acres of forest are significantly more land use than agriculture or wetlands or urban areas. But those of us in the forest products industry don't often remember that we actually have more surface area of water in the state of Michigan than we do with forests. Michigan is surrounded by 4 out of the 5 Great Lakes, and Michigan has legal jurisdiction over 45% of the Great Lakes. So we have, of our 25.5 million acres of water, almost 25 million acres of the Great Lakes is under Michigan's legal jurisdiction. We have 11,000 inland lakes, but all of these lakes combined are less than a million acres of surface area. So the Great Lakes really are the major water resource here in Michigan, and is exactly why we call ourselves the Great Lakes State. This really is a globally significant water resource. The Great Lakes are 20% of the world's available freshwater supply. And if Michigan has 45% of those Great Lakes, that's where we have our 9% of the world's freshwater supply is under Michigan's legal responsibility to take good care of those water resources. And even though we do a good job of putting an economic value on our forest products industry and the wood based products coming out of our forests, we really don't know the economic value of the water surrounding Michigan and the contribution of forests to providing clean water. Before we take a look at some of the water quality issues at a statewide level, I'd like to spend a couple of minutes and share a personal story about my home waters, the place where I grew up here in Michigan. This map is showing several lakes that are in Newaygo County, about an hour north of Grand Rapids, and just north of the city of Newaygo and the Muskegon River. In this central watershed there, that little micro watershed number 3, that lake with the orange dot on it is called Kimball Lake. And that orange dot is the location of where my parents live and have lived there for the last 30 years. And prior to that, my grandparents owned a cottage on this lake for 20 years prior to that. So for the last 50 years, my family has been on Kimball Lake and has enjoyed lake living like so many other people here in the state of Michigan. However, over the last 50 years, my family has noticed a significant decline in both water quality and the quality of fishing in Kimball Lake. And about 10 years ago, the residents around Kimball and Pickerel Lake, the larger lake to the east in that micro watershed number 3, they joined together and realized that all of the septic tanks surrounding those lakes was contributing to the water quality issues. So they put in a combined sewer system at great expense to the cottage owners there, where it was $10,000 to hook up to that sewer system and about $50 a month in cost to maintain that sewer system. And everyone was hoping that within a few years that would really significantly improve the water quality and the fishing would start to get better like it was back in the 60s and the 70s. Unfortunately, the water quality continued to decline and get worse instead of getting better, even 10 years after putting in that combined sewer system. So a few years ago, the Lake Association hired a limnologist from Grand Haven, and that company came up and tested all kinds of places within those two lakes and tested all of the inlets of little creeks coming into those lakes, and the results were quite frankly terrible. Kimball Lake is now classified as a hypereutrophic lake, and the major input of water coming into that lake is this blue line coming from Little Watershed 2 into Kimball Lake. That is a creek draining Ryerson Lake in this larger watershed number 2, and that creek is putting in an abundance of nitrogen and phosphorus and dissolved solids that is contributing to the water quality issues in Kimball Lake. And this little image here on the lower left-hand corner of the slide, that is a small dairy farm just 3/4 of a mile west of my parents' home, where the farmer has about 25 cows that are walking through a creek every day of the year, drinking out of that creek, and then also defecating in that creek. And that manure is directly input into Kimball Lake, less than a mile away. So what's interesting about this particular story is that this Kimball Lake is the westernmost lake in a chain of 4 lakes. And every summer it's always a fun thing to get in the fishing boat and go on a tour of all 4 lakes. And what's interesting is that the water quality gets better as you travel east. And that the 2 lakes over on the far east side of the chain, Emerald and Sylvan Lakes, are significantly cleaner than Kimball and Pickerel Lake. And after reading this report from the linologist, I realized that even though these lakes are connected, the water does not actually go from the second lake to the third lake, but instead, Penoyer Creek is a common drain draining water from these 2 sets of independent lakes. And the watersheds surrounding Emerald and Sylvan on the east side of this chain, this little micro watershed number 1, is entirely forested as compared to the watershed surrounding the Ryerson Lake that's draining into Kimball and Pickerel Lake is more than half agriculture. And so it's a very interesting test case to compare the influence of land use and how agriculture is contributing to significant water quality problems here in Michigan, whereas forests, and this is the Manistee National Forest surrounding Sylvan and Emerald Lake, is actually providing clean water into these 2 lakes. So it's been a very interesting test case to compare the impacts of land use on these lakes here in Michigan. And that is also happening at a grander scale statewide. And if you start to pay attention to water quality headlines and water quality reports here in Michigan, the news is bad. It's depressing. Even though Michigan markets itself as pure Michigan, unfortunately, when you peek behind the scenes and start to read water quality reports coming out of the Department of Environmental Quality, now EGLE, the Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, the news is terrible. And when you start looking for headlines, you'll see that there's an abundance of places throughout Michigan that are polluted, and there's a variety of sectors that are contributing to that. Agriculture and industry and cities are contributing to water quality issues here in Michigan, not only in Lake Erie in the southern part of the state, but also even up in Lake Superior. Take a look at this headline here on the bottom of the slide, where even Copper Harbor was dumping sewage into Lake Superior a couple of years ago. Lake Erie gets all the press for the big algae bloom that was impacting the city of Toledo, but a few years ago there was an algae bloom in Lake Superior over in the Apostle Islands north of Wisconsin. So throughout the Great Lakes, throughout Michigan, we're having problems with manure, being dumped into rivers, with combined sewer flows from cities, with chemical leaks and chemical spills, and the impacts of the industry here in the state of Michigan is really having significant impacts on our water quality throughout the state. Here is a map of the impaired watersheds here in Michigan. There's actually 3 maps here, and impaired watersheds are those where the Department of Environment and Great Lakes and Energy is actually regulating these watersheds, and there's a total maximum daily load of pollutants that are allowed into these watersheds. And each of these maps is showcasing different watersheds that are regulated because of different environmental problems. The map on the left is showing the watersheds that are impaired by agricultural chemicals and agricultural manure, as well as industrial chemicals. The center map there is our watersheds that are impaired because of E. coli, whether it's combined sewer systems coming from cities or manure coming from agriculture. There's a lot of watersheds in Michigan where E. coli is a significant pollutant, and many beaches in Michigan are closed each summer to swimming because of high E. coli levels. And even though a lot of these watersheds are concentrated in the southern part of the state, where we would expect to see more problems because of higher densities of agriculture and urban areas and industry, take a look at that map on the right where you'll see that even at a statewide level, chemicals like PCBs and mercury that are atmospherically deposited are impacting huge parts of the state of Michigan. So we have water quality problems throughout the entire state of Michigan, even if it is concentrated mostly in the southern part of the lower peninsula. Those of us that are anglers will often, when we get our fishing license, get the Michigan Fishing Guide that gives information about all the angling rules and regulations. And there's also information in there about what fish are safe to eat and what fish are not safe to eat. And even though I was looking for this information in the fishing guide a couple years ago, I couldn't find the page that I was looking for that would tell me, what species of fish not to eat from this river or that lake, and it referred me to a website called michigan.gov/eatsafefish. And when you go to that website, you'll see that there are actually 3,116 pages of fish consumption advisories telling people not to eat this species of fish more than 2 or 3 times a month because of the contaminants that are contained in the flesh of those fish. And they take a look at this map here on the left. Those red areas are not supporting fish consumption. And so all of those red areas are places where there are fish consumption advisories advising anglers not to eat more than, such and such amount of fish. And even Lake Superior has a fish consumption advisory for whitefish, one of our most famous species of fish and our most beloved lakes here in Michigan has fish consumption advisories. And it's not just pregnant women or children that shouldn't eat, more than 2 meals a month of Lake Superior whitefish, but nobody, no adult or child should eat more than 2 meals a month of Lake Superior whitefish because of dioxins and PCBs and toxaphene. So it's really disturbing to see how many fish consumption advisories we have here in the state of Michigan because our waters are polluted. And just a couple years ago, in 2018, was the first time that I've seen a do not eat advisory associated with deer. Deer hunters were advised over in Iosco County to not eat any deer that were harvested by Clark's Marsh, which is the part of the former Wurtsmith Air Force Base, because of PFAS. So here we have this chemical that is becoming more and more prevalent throughout the state of Michigan as a water contaminant because of industry or because of firefighting chemicals used, at Air Force bases and so forth. And now this chemical is actually getting into the tissue of deer at high enough levels that people should not eat deer that are contaminated with PFAS. Well, how about forestry? When logging, what about forest management? Is that contributing to pollution here in Michigan? The short answer is yes. Forest management does contribute some sediment pollution into our lakes and streams. However, in context with all the other causes of pollution in lakes and rivers, forest management and logging is a very small problem compared to other human activities. So yes, forest management does contribute some potential sediment into lakes and streams, but over the last 30 to 40 years, those of us in the logging and forestry and forest management business have done a great job of implementing best management practices and really reducing the amount of sediment that's being loaded into Michigan's lakes and rivers. So we can do more, and there's more that we can do to do a better job, but we need to acknowledge that forest management is a contributor to sediment pollution and other small types of pollution in Michigan and nationwide. So, shifting from water quality to take a look at water quantity for a few minutes, take a look at this slide about who uses water in Michigan. What about water consumption in Michigan? Well, this slide is actually total water use, and total water use includes water that is returned to the rivers and lakes after using it. And you can see that electrical power generation facilities by far use the most amount of water here in Michigan. But generally, they're going to be using that water to cool their power plants and then returning that water back into rivers and lakes and the Great Lakes. And even though there may be some thermal pollution associated with returning warm water, by and large, a lot of this water is being returned back to the rivers and lakes here in Michigan. So let's take a look at the consumptive water use, because this is the water that's extracted from groundwater and rivers and lakes and the Great Lakes and is not returned back to those water sources. And you can see here that the water use in Michigan is actually dominated by agriculture, where agricultural irrigation is a significant user of groundwater that is watering crops, and that water is evaporating and or being stored in the crops and is not being returned to groundwater. Other large users are public utilities that are distributing water to households in urban areas, as well as industry and electrical generation. Note that bottled water is a very small consumer of water at a statewide level. Now, Nestle sure gets a lot of bad press for their water use, and there certainly are critiques of the impacts at a small watershed level and how it may be impacting the groundwater in their streams in the immediate area of their wells. And I'm no fan of shipping bottled water out of the Great Lakes watershed and removing that water forever from the Great Lakes. But at a statewide scale, bottled water is actually a very small consumer of water in Michigan at only 0.2%. And you can see here that, Michigan uses more than 615 million gallons of water per day, and Nestle is using about 1 million gallons a day. So really, at a statewide level, bottled water is a fairly small user of water here in Michigan. Here's a list of the top 20 water users in Michigan with 2016 data. These are the most recent data that I could find from the Department of Environment and Great Lakes and Energy. And you can see here that industry is using a lot of water. And I believe this list is including both total water use and consumptive water use. Because, for instance, take a look there at number 4 and number 6. Verso's Escanaba and Quinnesec paper mills are consuming large amounts of water. But I was at a presentation a few years ago at the Society of American Foresters, and the manager of the Escanaba paper mill was reporting that yes, they use 38 million gallons of water a day extracting that from Lake Michigan, but they return 36 million gallons of water a day back into Lake Michigan. So Escanaba paper mill, Verso in Escanaba, they're using about 2 million gallons a day consumptive use, even though they're extracting 38 million gallons from Lake Michigan. And you can see here a list of other major corporations and industry that's using water. Note also number 10 and number 17, where there's some large farms that are using a lot of water on a daily basis. And apparently state law allows agricultural companies to remain confidential, so we don't know the names of those companies there. So again, thank you very much for joining us for Forest for Fish. Michigan is a unique place in the world with an abundance of forests and water resources. Unfortunately, we're not doing a very good job of taking care of those water resources. We have a lot of pollution throughout the state. But the good news is that forests are part of the solution. And foresters and loggers and truckers and the forest products industry as a whole, we're part of the solution because forests provide an abundance of clean water and quality fish habitat.